Welcome to another episode of the Midnight Investigator, where we take another alternative look at moments in history. Okay, so you've probably heard the story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin because it's been retold so many times it feels like a dark fairy tale. Most people know it through later storytellers like the Brothers Grimm, who helped lock the legend into popular culture. In their version, a mysterious musician in bright clothing arrives in a German town plagued by rats, plays a tune that pulls the vermin away, and then turns his music on the children when the townspeople refuse to pay him. Now, it's usually framed as a simple moral undertaking about keeping your promises. But this is the point where the story stops being about morals and starts leaning into something far darker. Because buried under the fairy tale is a thread of fact. And the most disturbing part is this: in the earliest versions, there are no rats, no lesson, no tidy warning. There is only one thing recorded with any clarity, and that's the children. Hamelin's own historical notes point to a specific date in the 1200s when a figure in colorful clothing led a large group of local children out of the town, and they never returned. So the question isn't just what's the lesson? The question is, what actually happened in Hamelin that was so real, so traumatic, that it was written down and remembered for centuries, and then later wrapped in a fairy tale to make it easier to tell? The town of Hamelin, Germany, has records of a real-life tragedy. An inscription on a building, the Rattenfänger House, or House of the Piper, reads, "In the year 1284, on the day of Saints John and Paul, the 26th of June, 130 children born in Hamelin were led out of the town by a piper dressed in all kinds of colors and were lost." Okay, this isn't just a folktale. It's a historical event that traumatized a community. For centuries, town documents were even dated by how many years it had been since the going out of the children. Now, before being destroyed in a fire, there was a stained glass window in a church, created around the year 1300, depicted the piper leading the children away. Although the original stained glass window is gone, a copy from 1592 survives, showing the scene in eerie detail. To this day, there's a street in Hamelin called Bungelassenstrasse, the street without drums, where no music is allowed, because it's said to be the last place the children were seen. So yes, something devastating happened in Hamelin on June 26, 1284. Not once upon a time, not long ago. A date. A day. A wound in the town's memory that was sharp enough to be written down and carried forward. And that's where the story becomes genuinely unsettling. Because when you go back to the earliest references, the comforting fairy tale facade isn't there. There are no rats. No infestation. No heroic contract. No lesson about paying your debts. Those pieces arrive centuries later, like someone bolted a moral onto the front of something that was originally just described as loss. So, the earliest thread is much colder. A piper dressed in many colors appears, and then the children are gone. That's it, not metaphorically, not symbolically. Gone in the way that makes a town go quiet. Gone in the way that forces people to avoid a street, to mark anniversaries, to tell the story carefully, the same way families do when something happened that they can't fully face. And when later generations looked back at that raw event, what do you do with it? A mass disappearance isn't a tidy story. It doesn't teach a simple lesson. It doesn't resolve. So over time, the tale gets softened and structured. A rat plague gives the piper a purpose. A broken promise gives the town a reason to deserve what happened. It turns horror into a parable, which is exactly what people do when the real explanation is either unknown or unbearable. So, if the rats aren't original, then the revenge motive isn't original either. The earliest version isn't saying they cheated him, so he punished them. It's simply recording that on a certain day, a stranger led the town's children away and they never returned. And that flips the whole story on its head. It stops being about greed. It stops being about a lesson. It becomes a question that's much harder to sit with. What kind of event makes an entire group vanish and leaves behind nothing but a name, a date, and a figure in bright clothes? And that's why this legend refuses to die. Because somewhere under the fairy tale paint, it behaves like a real historical mystery. People have spent centuries arguing over what it could have been: disease, accident, migration, cult panic, recruitment, abduction, and none of those theories feel fully satisfying. Because they all clash with the same uncomfortable detail. The story doesn't begin with rats. It begins with children walking out of town together, as if they believed they were going somewhere they were meant to go, and then the trail stops. The fairy tale wants you to focus on the piper's anger. History forces you to focus on the silence that came after. So let's dive into these theories. and let's see what we can come up with. One of the most common interpretations is that the Pied Piper is a metaphor for death. In the Middle Ages, death was often depicted as a skeletal figure in multicolored, or pied, clothing, leading people away in a grim dance. The piper's music, then, would be a symbol for a deadly epidemic that swept through the town, taking only the young. The rats, added later, would fit perfectly, as they're famously associated with spreading plague. However, there's a big problem with this theory. The Black Death, the Great Plague pandemic, didn't hit Europe until the mid-1300s, more than 60 years after the Hamelin incident in 1284. And a disease that specifically targets and kills 130 children in a single day, while sparing the adults, is highly improbable. So, while the Piper as death idea is powerful, it's more likely a later interpretation, a way for people to make sense of the tragedy using familiar symbols, rather than a literal explanation. So, I think we can rule that one out. Okay, there is another theory linking Hamelin's lost children to the so-called Children's Crusade of 1212. It's the story of thousands of young people following so-called charismatic child leaders toward the Holy Land. Now, later accounts say it ended in disaster, hunger, drowning, and exploitation. The parallels sound tempting. A crowd of the young, a leader figure, a journey that ends with nobody coming home. And you don't even need magic for that to happen. History shows how recruitment works when it's wrapped in purpose and belonging. In the First World War, Pals and Chums battalions formed because friends enlisted together, pulled along by camaraderie and pressure, until whole groups marched off as one. A medieval town could have felt a similar force. A recruiter, a pilgrimage, a promise of work or salvation, and suddenly the youth are gone before anyone truly understands what they've agreed to. But there's just one problem, and it's fatal to the theory if we're sticking to the timeline. The Children's Crusade is 1212. Hamelin's recorded loss is 1284. That's more than 70 years apart. So while the idea is useful for understanding how large groups of young people can be swept up and vanish into history, it doesn't fit as a direct explanation for Hamelin. On dates alone, we have to rule it out as the answer and keep looking. Okay, then there's the strange phenomenon of dancing mania. Now, believe it or not, there are historical accounts of people, sometimes entire groups, who were seized by an uncontrollable urge to dance, often for days until they collapse from exhaustion. In 1237, decades before the Hamelin disappearance, there are accounts describing something strange near Erfurt in central Germany in the state of Thuringia. A group of children are said to have danced and leapt for miles to another town, with some collapsing and, in some versions, dying afterward. It's hard to verify the details now, but the shape of the story matters. A crowd, moving as one, as if pulled by an invisible force. Now this sounds extremely familiar. This opens up one of the darker natural explanations for Hamelin: mass psychogenic illness. The kind of collective trance or panic that can spread through a group, especially in an anxious, superstitious age. In that reading, the Piper's music isn't literal magic. It's a metaphor, a way of describing a compulsion that feels irresistible from the inside and looks impossible from the outside. And the timing makes the legend feel even more charged. The Hamelin incident is remembered as happening on June 26th, right in the midsummer window, when communities held festivals, vigils, and older seasonal traditions that the church didn't always agree with. If the children were out on the hills for a celebration, a game, a ritual, or just a gathering away from adult eyes, then the Piper could be the story's way of explaining why they went there in the first place. And the mountain detail is where it gets truly sinister. Some versions say the hillside opened and swallowed them. Taken literally, that's fantasy. Taken as memory, it could be something blunt and physical. A collapse, a sinkhole, a landslide, a sudden disaster in terrain locals didn't fully understand. And as grim as that sounds, history shows how fast it can happen. In Aberfan in 1966, a hillside collapse buried a school in seconds. One moment the children were there. The next they were simply gone. But okay, none of this is proven. It's an attempt to explain how a town could lose a whole group in a single day, and later turn it into a story with a human face, a man in bright clothes, a tune, a direction of travel. Because they followed the Piper is easier to repeat than we don't know what happened on that hill. We only know they never came back. But perhaps the most plausible and widely supported historical theory is far less supernatural. It suggests the story is actually about mass immigration. In the 13th century, German rulers and bishops were actively recruiting settlers to colonize territories in Eastern Europe, like parts of modern-day Poland and Romania. These recruiters, known as locators, would travel from town to town, promising a better life to anyone willing to move east. In this scenario, the Pied Piper was one of these recruiters, dressed in bright clothing to attract attention. The term children of Hamelin might not have meant literal kids, but the youth and young families of the town an entire generation. The Piper didn't lure them with magic, but with promises of land and opportunity. They weren't lost in a cave. They simply packed up and left. The Brothers Grimm even included a note in their version of the tale saying, "Some say that the children were led into a cave and came out again in Transylvania, and believe it or not, there's evidence for this." Family names from the Hamelin area suddenly appear in records from these eastern settlement regions in the decades following 1284. So, the story of the lost children might be the sorrowful memory of a town that saw its next generation vanish, not to a magical doom, but to a new life hundreds of miles away. Of course, there are darker, more sinister theories too. Some speculate it was a mass abduction, with the Piper being a trafficker who sold the children into labor or slavery. Others suggest the story is a distorted memory of a military tragedy, where the town's youth were conscripted for a battle and never returned. And in the most modern, sensationalist take, some have even proposed the Piper was a serial killer, though there is absolutely no historical evidence to support this horror movie plot. After more than 700 years, the Pied Piper of Hamelin remains a haunting enigma, blurring the line between history and legend. Was he a bringer of death, a religious fanatic, a slick recruiter, or something else entirely? We may never know for sure. What is certain is that a real tragedy occurred, a deep wound in the town's memory that was passed down through generations. The story of the Piper and the rats became the folklore we know today, but behind it lies the very real and very mysterious disappearance of 130 children. The melody of the Piper's flute has faded, but the echo of his mystery still calls to us from across the centuries. Okay, so that's the darker side of an old fairy tale. I hope you enjoyed this episode. You've been watching the Midnight Investigator. If this is your kind of thing, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. We'll be back soon with more investigations. In the meantime, question everything. Don't let someone else do your thinking, even when it's just an old fairy tale.